Picture this. It's September 9th, 1965. You're standing on your roof in New Orleans' lower Ninth Ward. The water came so fast, 30 minutes, that's all it took to fill your house from floor to ceiling. You scrambled up here with your family, and now you're trapped. Rain is pelting down. You're cold, terrified, and you've been here for 18 hours with no rescue in sight. And then you hear it. Boom, an explosion. Then another, and another. Your neighbors hear it too. Everyone hears it. And suddenly, you're not just wondering if you'll survive. You're wondering if your own government just tried to kill you. Welcome to American Scandal Report by Scoob, and I'm your host, Oz Dalton, the billion-dollar disaster that tore through Louisiana in 1965. But here's the thing. Was it really a natural disaster at all? Or was it a catastrophe decades in the making, written into the landscape by human hands and political decisions? And when the water finally receded, why did some neighborhoods get help while others got loans and broken promises? I'm going to tell you a story about a hurricane that became a scandal, about conspiracy theories rooted in historical trauma, and about how the seeds of Katrina were planted 40 years before that storm ever formed. Because what happened during Hurricane Betsy wasn't just about wind and water. It was about race, power, and who gets to be safe in America. Let's rewind a few days. It's September 8th, 1965, and Hurricane Betsy is churning across the Gulf of Mexico. This storm has already terrorized the Florida Keys with 150-mile-per-hour winds. People watched their boats get tossed around like toys, their homes shredded. But Florida was just the warm-up act. As Betsy moved into the Gulf, it wasn't slowing down, it was getting angry. Within hours, reconnaissance aircraft were reporting winds back up to 150 miles per hour. The forward speed was increasing. The direction north-northwest, straight toward Louisiana. Along Florida's Gulf Coast, the tides had been weirdly low the day before, one of those eerie calm before the storm moments. But once Betsy entered the Gulf, all hell broke loose. Between Clearwater and Pensacola, tides surged. At St. Mark's, the water reached 11.57 feet above mean low water, just inches shy of a record that had stood since 1877. Seawalls crumbled. Piers were demolished along the Ochlockonee River. Houses on Alligator Point were undermined, their foundations literally washed away. And remember, this was all from a hurricane that passed several hundred miles offshore. By the morning of September 9th, Louisiana residents knew what was coming. Warnings went out. People boarded up windows, gathered supplies, moved valuables to higher ground. They did everything right. But how do you prepare for a monster? Just before midnight, Hurricane Betsy made landfall over the low, marshy expanses of the Mississippi River Delta. And when I say this storm was a monster, I mean it literally. At Grand Isle, wind gusts were estimated at 160 miles per hour. The barometric pressure dropped to 28.00 inches, a reading that basically means you're inside nature's pressure cooker. At Port Sulphur, sustained winds hit 136 miles per hour, with gusts of 145. The winds were as strong as what had been recorded in the Florida Keys. Hurricane-force winds battered Louisiana from Grand Isle all the way up to Baton Rouge, where the Mississippi River crested at 15.5 feet above sea level. In New Orleans, the Mississippi River rose more than 10 feet. Think about that. The mighty Mississippi, that massive artery of American commerce, swelling like a bloated corpse. Winds of 125 miles per hour peeled back roofs, like they were opening tin cans. Billboards became flying guillotines. Utility poles snapped like toothpicks. One witness said Canal Street looked like the day after Mardi Gras, only much worse. If you've ever seen the aftermath of Mardi Gras, you know that's saying something. In the Mississippi River, between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, ships, tugs, and barges were torn from their moorings and tossed around. Hundreds of barges either sank or were driven aground. One of them contained 600 tons of chlorine gas and went down near the Louisiana State University campus. Can you imagine? In the middle of this hurricane nightmare, there's a barge full of poison gas sitting on the bottom of the river, just waiting to become an even bigger disaster. Fortunately, it was safely refloated a week later, but that's the kind of close call that keeps emergency managers awake at night. But the real story, the one that would define Betsy's legacy and haunt New Orleans for decades, was what happened to the levees. Here's something you need to understand about New Orleans. Most of the city is below sea level. It's surrounded by an elaborate system of levees, canals, and pumping stations. Without these, the city would simply cease to exist. It would return to the swamp it was built on. The pumping system in New Orleans is the largest in the world. On a normal day, it's an engineering marvel. But September 9th, 1965 was not a normal day. As Hurricane Betsy swept through, the city's levees couldn't hold back the tremendous quantity of seawater that immersed the region. The massive pumping system was overloaded. And then 90% of the city lost electrical power. The pumps failed. One woman later described what happened. The rush of water was so great that it filled her home to the ceiling within 30 minutes. 30 minutes. She had to scramble onto her roof with her family, where they waited in driving rain for up to 20 hours before rescue teams could reach them. Over 300 city blocks were submerged. And here's the cruel twist. In some areas, the flooding was delayed and didn't peak until hours after the storm had passed. People thought they'd made it through, thought they were safe, and then the water came. Since natural drainage isn't possible in New Orleans, remember it's below sea level, the floodwaters remained for several days. Several days of sitting in contaminated water, of waiting to be evacuated, of watching everything you own dissolve into toxic sludge. But why was the flooding so catastrophic? Why did New Orleans, which had survived hurricanes before, get hit so hard? The answer has a name, the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, or MR-GO. Say it fast and it sounds like Mr. Go, which is darkly appropriate because this canal basically said go ahead to hurricane storm surge. Soon after MRGO was built, the environmental catastrophe it created became evident. Ghost cypress tree trunks stood everywhere in the water like witnesses, evidence of vanquished cypress forests. The now unrestrained salt water that flowed in from the Gulf damaged surrounding wetlands and lagoons and eroded the natural storm surge barrier, protecting low-lying places like New Orleans East. Think of wetlands as nature's sponge. They absorb storm surge, slow it down, protect the land behind them. But MRGO destroyed those wetlands. And during Hurricane Betsy, this is exactly what happened. Those 100-plus mile-per-hour winds blew in from the east, pushing swollen Gulf waters across Lake Borgne, a vast lagoon surrounded by marshes and open to the Gulf. The water entered the funnel formed by the Intracoastal Waterway and MRGO. Within this network of man-made canals, the storm surge reached 10 feet and topped the levees surrounding it, breaching some. At the same time, Lake Pontchartrain's surge entered the Industrial Canal and ruptured adjacent levees, including those in the lower Ninth Ward. The lower Ninth was topographically higher than the east, but it was equally vulnerable because of how close it was to the canal. More than 160,000 homes flooded. In some places, water rose to the eaves. One resident, Walter Davis, said, "I was thinking, man, I can tell my grandkids about this. That's how awesome Betsy was." It was a flood so devastating that Betsy's name was retired from the tropical cyclone naming list, a fate reserved only for the most destructive storms. And this is where our story takes a dark turn. Because in the middle of all this chaos, the wind, the rain, the rising water, people heard something. Something that shouldn't have been there. Boom, 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 explosions. Multiple witnesses reported hearing dynamite in the middle of their scrambling in the midst of the storm. The levees were blown on purpose, residents would later insist. Now, before you dismiss this as panic and confusion in a chaotic situation, you need to understand these people had historical precedent for their suspicions. During the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, the federal government did intentionally use dynamite on a levee at Caernarvon, Louisiana. The goal? Protect New Orleans by deliberately flooding St. Bernard Parish. Sacrifice the rural and poor to save the urban and wealthy. It actually happened. So when people heard explosions during Betsy, when they saw how the worst flooding happened in the poorest, blackest neighborhoods, when they noticed that wealthier, wider areas like the French Quarter and the Central Business District seemed to fare better, they connected the dots. The levee bombing conspiracy theory was born, and it would persist for decades. Now here's what the engineers and government officials said. Those sounds weren't dynamite. They were the sounds of massive structural failures, flood walls and levees collapsing under the immense pressure of storm surge. When you have 16 feet of water pressing against a concrete wall that wasn't designed to handle it, when earth and concrete give way under that kind of pressure, it sounds like an explosion. Thorough investigations found no evidence of intentional sabotage. The storm surge simply overtopped and eroded levees that hadn't been designed to withstand a storm of Betsy's strength. The materials and construction methods were insufficient. But here's the thing, just because the conspiracy theory isn't true doesn't mean it isn't important. Because the theory itself tells us something crucial about the relationship between the city's black residents and their government. Let's talk about who bore the brunt of Betsy's fury. The flood walls along the industrial canal collapsed, or as some residents suspected, were bombed. An ocean of water surged through New Orleans' lower Ninth Ward. The flood stretched from Gentilly into St. Bernard Parish. But the worst of it was in the lower Ninth, where more than 6,000 houses flooded. Most of those houses belonged to African Americans. The water stood for more than a week, washing the smiles from photographs, disintegrating furniture, floors, and walls. The flood drowned at least 50 people, some in the attics of their own homes. Houses that represented, for them, a hard-earned piece of the American dream became their tombs. Let me tell you about Lucille Duminy. She made it through the flood, barely. She and her 2 children nearly drowned. Her husband was in the hospital. She hadn't slept in days. And when things finally calmed down enough, she made her way to the Red Cross office to get help. She waited in line. When she finally reached the front, the woman at the desk asked her, "Do you need help?" Duminy straightened her back and stared the woman in the eye, incredulous. "Could you repeat the question, please?" So the agent asked again, "Do you need assistance?" Duminy was getting, as she put it, pissed off. She said, "You know the Gulf of Mexico. Do you see the water they have in there?" "Yes," the agent said. "Well, that's how much water we had. I could see just the roof of my house. That's all I could see. And you're asking me what I need? I need everything. I need a house and everything that goes in a house. I lost things that I can never replace." Lucille Duminy believed the government had risked killing her and her family because they were black. And she wasn't alone in that belief. After hammering the Delta region on September 9th, Betsy moved through central Louisiana and into eastern Arkansas. The winds diminished, but heavy rains continued as it drifted toward the Ohio Valley as a tropical storm. It took weeks to assess the full scope of the damage. Louisiana clearly suffered the greatest losses. More than 27,000 homes destroyed or severely damaged. Over 17,000 people injured. 679 hospitalized, 58 dead. The destruction in Louisiana was tallied at over $1.2 billion. To put that in perspective, this made Betsy by far the most expensive hurricane in US history up to that time. And that's without even factoring in the losses in Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas. In the days after Betsy, people tallied their losses in more personal terms. Mud everywhere, drowned rats and dead cats floating in the streets. National Guard trucks driving around. Some people arrested for looting. Sewage from canals rose in people's toilets and tubs like the devil's bath. The foundation of the dream was bad, and people who dared to look close knew that what Governor John McKeithen promised on television and radio, that nothing like this will ever happen again, was a lie. President Lyndon Johnson flew into the lower Ninth Ward the next day. The area was already a drowned and abandoned symbol of water's destructive power when facilitated by human error. Johnson declared the city and surrounding areas a disaster zone and pledged an $85 million protection plan to rebuild levees and shore up flood protection systems. And those flood protection systems would fail again 40 years later during Hurricane Katrina. Here's where the scandal really begins. Because after Betsy, there was a massive debate about what kind of help victims should receive. And the outcome of that debate would reveal everything about who matters in America. Lucille Duminy and her neighbors in the lower Ninth Ward never thought of Betsy as a natural disaster. They believed their suffering had been caused by human decisions. The decision to build MRGO, the decision to develop low-lying areas without adequate flood protection, the decision to neglect black neighborhoods when it came to infrastructure investment. It followed, therefore, that they were owed reparations. They lobbied for direct cash aid, grants, not loans, that would offer them the autonomy to recover as they believed best. The Civil Rights Act had just been passed. The Voting Rights Act had just been signed. The Great Society promised a new era of federal involvement in addressing poverty and inequality. The people of the lower Ninth Ward saw themselves, tentatively but increasingly, as partners with the federal government. After Betsy, they tried to call on that partnership, but the men who controlled Democratic politics, both in Louisiana and in Washington, understood the disaster differently. President Johnson called it an injury that has been done by nature, an act of God that government had no role in causing and no obligation to fix. Although some legislators initially advocated for grants, they saw relief as charity for an unlucky few in the wake of a blameless accident. They did not envision it as restitution for damages wrought by human action. So, what did victims get? Loans. The relief program hinged on loans from the Federal Small Business Administration. The amount of aid was unprecedented, sure, but in the lower Ninth Ward, the policy seemed perverse. Think about it. The loans forced people into debt to the same government they believed responsible for their losses in the first place. Posters appeared on telephone poles across the ravaged lower Ninth Ward. 40 years of debt is not freedom. Some residents were too poor to qualify for the loans in the first place. For those who did qualify, the loans often amounted to a second mortgage against a house that no longer existed. The debt bound them to a neighborhood that had proven unsafe. And yet in Washington, politicians celebrated these relief funds as a triumph. After decades of railing against federal intervention, proponents of states' rights suddenly welcomed federal involvement. Governor McKeithen told Congress, "Americanism in our state has perhaps been reawakened and revitalized, because when we got in trouble, no fault or no suggestion was made. Well, you people have been talking down there about states' rights. You can take care of your own problems." These politicians believed they had pioneered a program of compassionate disaster assistance and helped repair a country fractured by struggles over civil rights. But in the lower Ninth Ward, African Americans came to believe that not only had the government caused the flood in the first place, it had also broken a promise to help them recover from it. The welfare state, they learned, was like a levee. Politicians could make cuts for some to give security to others. In 1965, the Louisiana Weekly published an editorial that in hindsight reads like prophecy. The editors wrote, "We are fully aware that an inquiry cannot return a single hurricane dead, or a single penny of the hundreds of millions of dollars in property losses. But we are also aware that Hurricane Betsy will not be the last or necessarily the worst such catastrophe. Therefore, unless we learn some vital lessons from it, we may be courting the greatest disaster yet." They were right. 40 years later, in August 2005, the flood protection systems that had been rebuilt and supposedly strengthened after Betsy failed again. Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans in much the same way Betsy had. The lower Ninth Ward once again served as a diorama for all aspects of the city's tragedy. But here's what makes this even more heartbreaking. Many people who made claims about the neighborhood's significance during Katrina didn't know much about its history. They didn't know about Betsy. They didn't know about MRGO. They didn't know about the loan programs that trapped people in debt. They didn't know about the explosions people heard, about Lucille Jumini's righteous anger, about the decades of neglect. And the conspiracy theory? It came roaring back during Katrina. Once again, people reported hearing explosions. Once again, they believed the levees had been intentionally destroyed to protect wealthier neighborhoods. And once again, they had historical precedent and lived experience telling them that their government would sacrifice them if necessary. So what were the real lessons Hurricane Betsy was supposed to teach us? First, that so-called natural disasters are rarely natural. Vulnerability is built by policy decisions, neglected infrastructure, and communities pushed into harm's way. Second, how we explain disasters determines how we respond. If storms are framed as acts of God, help becomes charity. But if they're the result of human choices, then aid is restitution, something owed, not gifted. And finally, the stories people tell themselves matter. The residents of the lower Ninth Ward didn't see themselves as victims of a storm, but of a state that had failed them for decades. That's why conspiracy theories filled the silence where accountability should have lived. Not as fantasy, but as an attempt to explain cruelty that felt deliberate. Hurricane Betsy wasn't just a warning, it was a rehearsal, and the cost of ignoring its lessons would come due years later. If you want to hear the full story and the details history tried to forget, download the Scoob app now to get complete access to this episode and many more.